All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Hiromu, and today I'll be presenting on legacy and dualities, creating historic vehicles of the future. So first of all, I wanted to preface everything by kind of setting up like where I came from before this. So actually, right before this conference, I was at another conference called The Future of the Car in London, which was very interesting. There were many renowned automotive executives, such as the CEO of Renault, Volvo, as well as Mercedes-Benz, and Elon Musk, as you can see in this picture. It was very interesting being in that conference because they spoke about a lot of the executives spoke about what their vision for the future of the vehicle is. And now I'm here talking about historic vehicles and the past of the vehicles. And even though these two topics may seem very different, I think they are actually dualities, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, and how they may seem like opposites, but together I think they are more powerful, and I do value both. So just wanted to give a quick about me. So basically, I'm currently a student at Harvard studying mechanical engineering. Back to the topic of dualities, this is another one where Harvard is not usually known as a mechanical engineering school or an automotive school, but that's my interest, as well as I also get to study liberal arts there, which has been a very interesting mix, and it's given me a very interesting perspective. As well as I did start a new organization called the Harvard Undergraduate Automotive Society. There was a lot of growing interest in the automotive industry and motorsports, such as F1 being very popular in the US now. So that is an organization that I co-founded this year, actually, and I've continued to pursue my interests in the automotive industry within my school. Outside of school, I've done a couple of internships at some automotive companies, automotive tech companies, so to say. I have worked at Tesla, Waymo, which is Google X's self-driving car company, and Arrival, which is a newer electric vehicle startup. And I think to tie it back to my origins, I was born in Japan, but grew up for most of my life in Spain, and then moved to the US afterwards. And I am half Japanese and half American, which ties into the next point of what my heritage is and what the legacy has been that I've been handed on. So I want to start off with a tale of two grandfathers. So on the left, you'll see Haruki Hirano, who is my grandfather on my Japanese side, and he's from Fukuoka, Japan, and we'll dive into him in a bit. On the right is my grandpa on my American side, Dave Rose. He was from Montana, and we'll also get to see a little bit of his history and see how both of these grandfathers tie into a legacy that has been left on to me. So to start off with Grandpa Haruki, or Gigi, as I affectionately call him, he's basically been really into cars in general since his youth. So basically, when he was about 20-something years old, he decided to start his own car dealership / company, where he's been selling cars for the last 50 years. So that's been a big part of my life. Whenever I would go back home to Japan to visit family, I would always be around cars, and he would always tell me about the cars that he was interested in, such as the Mazda Familia or the Honda Vamos, which are some cars that he had in his dealership, as well as the cars that he was interested in, such as the Datsun 240Z. This was a big part of the influences in my childhood as to why I was interested in cars, because I was surrounded by them whenever I would go back. Now, up to my grandpa Dave. So my grandpa Dave from Montana, he was a car fanatic. Basically, he loved racing cars, he loved collecting them, and he also did do some engineering. So a story is that he was a chemical engineer, but he dropped out to decide to pursue his passion of racing, and he would basically use his chemical engineering knowledge to develop his own fuel for his racing. So I never actually got to meet my grandfather in person, as he passed away before I was born, but his influence has been a big part of my life, as my whole family on my dad's side is a big car family in general. They have been owners of many Fords and just muscle cars in general has been embedded in our family on that side. My grandpa raced cars such as the 1980 Ford Thunderbird Superstock, as well as he raced in the Wissota Modified in 1992. In the top left, you can see a picture of him with a family friend and my father actually. And you can see some of his other cars on the right and in the bottom that he raced in and he won prizes in. So now this is very interesting because you can see that both Japanese cars and American cars have been a big influence in my life, and I've been greatly inspired by them. But in reality, my favorite type of car is actually Italian cars. So quite interestingly, I've always been fascinated by Italian cars since my childhood, not by influence of either my grandparents on both sides or my families on both sides. I think when I first saw the Lamborghini Countach when I was very young, I just fell in love with it, and all I could do was ask my parents about like Lamborghinis and if I could go see them. And as you can see on the right, I couldn't afford an actual Lamborghini, but they ended up giving me a cup of a Lamborghini Diablo, so that was something that I still even have today. As well as this continued into my developing interest in Italian cars. I've been interested in like Ferraris, Lancias, Maseratis, like all sorts of Italian cars, and I think one of the most captivating reasons why I love Italian cars is not only that they are amazing engineering marvels, but that they are just pure aesthetic beauties as well. I think, in my personal opinion, Italian cars are very hard to beat in terms of aesthetics, and that interest has kind of translated to me wanting to work in the automotive industry. Now, it's very interesting because here, these are the influences of historic cars on my life, but quite recently, I have been working on newer automotive tech companies, so to say. So I have worked at 3 newer automotive companies. The first one was Tesla. I was working there as an engineering project manager on the Tesla Model S Plaid battery pack, which was very interesting because battery pack and the powertrain is basically the heart of the Tesla Model S Plaid in this case. And it was really interesting working there because I got to see how the effects of the battery and that architecture would play onto the design of the whole vehicle. And as well as getting involved in the manufacturing process of it, which was one of the toughest experiences ever, but it was very interesting working at a fast-paced company like that that's looking to revolutionize the automotive world. My other experience is at Waymo, where I was working as a technical program manager on the Waymo LiDAR and camera sensor suites. So autonomous vehicles are very interesting because, as you can see here in the picture where I'm with the vehicle, it's a lot of autonomous vehicles nowadays are regular cars with autonomous sensors kind of retrofitted, so to say, onto them. And I think it was a really interesting experience working there as well because it very much didn't feel much like an automotive company, but it felt much more like a tech company, so to say, even though autonomous vehicles will probably revolutionize the way people commute and move. Next up, I got to work at Arrival, which is a new electric vehicle startup. And at Arrival, I got to work on the role of vehicle architecture, where I got to kind of define concepts and define the packaging. As you can see here, there's a little mannequin there with some basic lines and targets, basically, that I was setting. But I got to work on this Arrival car, which is a new project that was meant to be a vehicle that's a collaboration with Uber, which is a ride-sharing service. And it was supposed to be a car that's solely designed for the purpose of ride-sharing. So ride-sharing is also a relatively new phenomenon where people end up sharing cars and carpooling, so to say. And I think it was really interesting working here as well because this is another direction that the cars of the future are heading. Now, looking at all 3 of these vehicles, it's very interesting to see because I've heard many people say that electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, they can seem very soulless, so to say, or that they are just merely commercialized vehicles that are just mass-produced and more seen as a commodity and less as something that's beautiful or enjoyable to have as the vehicles that I've shown before. I think it's very interesting, and this ties back to my topic of duality, where we look at two things that might seem opposite, but we try to reconcile them together. I think my interest has lied in old historic vehicles as well as newer automotive tech companies and vehicles, and I want to kind of reconcile both to basically create the historic vehicles of the future, which leads to the question of what will the future historic cars be? This is a question that I've deeply thought about because I keep thinking 100 years from now, what will be the historic cars that people will be talking about? I think that's a very interesting question to consider, especially as most people here come from a background of enjoying the historic cars of more in the past, previous to the years of like before 2000. And I think as the years progress, though, it'll be harder to maintain them and keep them in a shape where, for example, in the year 2100, like we're still able to drive them. So I think it will be very important to create vehicles that have their own character for the future and that can become historic vehicles of the future. So I think it's very interesting to look at these three companies that I've worked at and see how they could potentially fit in the role of history. Looking at the first case on the left with the Tesla Roadster, the first generation Roadster, this vehicle some people I've talked to have even considered them historic vehicles now just because of the impact that they've had and how Tesla Roadster was the first produced electric vehicle that was made with lithium-ion cells, and basically this is and potentially will be a historic vehicle of the future. As well as looking at the middle, Waymo Firefly, this is basically the first autonomous vehicle that traveled on public roads. So in the sense of the common car context, they may not be considered historic vehicles, but they do play an important part in historic vehicles if autonomous vehicles do become our future. And looking at the right is the Arrival car, which is the first specifically designed for ride-hailing car. I think this car is very interesting because it still has not gone in production, and I had a part to play in it, but it'll be very interesting to see if something like this, if it's produced, if it will become a historic vehicle of the future, or if it's too modern and futuristic to be a vehicle of the future. I think one important thing to note, though, is that whenever there's any sort of radical change, there will be resistance to it, and maybe later on, once we look back to it, we will see that those cars are actually very significant historically. So looking at the three cases of Japanese cars, American cars, and Italian cars, similar to the introduction that I had, if we look at the Subaru 360, this is a car that kind of signified the beginning of the K car, or the mini car in Japan, which many people didn't consider cars back then, just because it looked so different, it felt so different, the size was so different. I think also if we look to the middle, to the Pontiac GTO, it's very interesting because muscle cars look very different from cars as they were previously seen as in that time period. So I think muscle cars brought along a new wave of cars and redefined what a car could be. I think also very interestingly on the right, the Alfa Romeo Carabo, which is designed by Marcello Gandini, I think it's very interesting because this concept car signified the beginning of the wedge-shaped supercar with its scissor doors, and nowadays that wedge shape is something that we instantly recognize in our sports car, but back then it was seen as something so revolutionary that this didn't look like any of the cars that we've seen in the past. So I think based off of these things, I do want to consider and think that electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, although they do seem innovative, at the same time, a lot of times they are merely ICE vehicles with a battery pack stuck on them, an electric powertrain, or an ICE vehicle with autonomous sensors just stuck onto it. And basically, I think to the argument of people considering them soulless or not having their own character, I think the reason why is because these cars do seem to kind of hold on to the past and try to replicate something in the past, even though they are something completely new. I, as a vehicle architect, strongly and firmly believe that electric vehicles of the future, for example, can sort of form new sort of vehicle architectures that are allowed by these new powertrains. And even as we get newer technologies such as fuel cells or maybe even something crazy like solar-powered cars, I think newer architectures will be possible to make, but I do think that we do need to appreciate the past but look forward to the future. So I think wrapping up everything into my conclusion, I do want to go back to my initial two topics of legacy and duality. I think focusing on the topic of legacy, on the picture on the left is a picture of the Rose family, so that's my family, and that is my great-great-grandfather on the right, my great-grandfather on the left of him, my grandfather on the left of him, and my father, who was very young at the time, in the bottom. That's 4 generations of car enthusiasts right there, and here, speaking to you today, is the 5th generation. Legacy has been a really important part of my life, and how historic vehicles and appreciation for them has been passed down through our family. And I do hope to maintain this legacy and pass this on to the future generations in my family as well. And in the middle too, you see a picture of my great-grandfather with his 1940 Lincoln Zephyr with a flat V12 on it, with a flathead V12. Basically, this is a car that my great-grandfather ended up giving to my father after he passed away, and my father has inherited this car. And this is a car that hopefully one day I will inherit as well and pass on to my future generations to show the significance of legacy of classic cars. And on the right is my grandfather, who is currently still alive and doing very well. This is him in his car dealership, still working with K cars or mini cars. But this is the new generation of K cars, and I think it's very interesting to see how the K cars in Japan have evolved over time as well. And finally, going back to the topic of duality, so on the right, my professor actually at Harvard told me one thing, which was that a lot of times when we are kids, we do fantasize about cars, and when we do end up growing up and maybe making enough money to purchase a car, we do end up wanting to buy the cars that we fantasize about as a kid. So I think hopefully one day I'll be able to purchase a Lamborghini Countach. That's an aspiration of mine one day. But I think it's interesting to look at the Countach as well, because just to wrap up my thoughts on duality, I think it's very interesting to remember the past but look to the future. So basically the Countach, I appreciate it for the vehicle that it is, but I personally would not want to have another Countach, so to say. So as a vehicle architect, I do hope to continue to be able to design vehicles and engineer vehicles that will be future historic vehicles, but not necessarily be too caught up with the past in terms of replicating it. I do think the past should be appreciated, but for the future, we must learn to innovate and let go of the past to be able to make future vehicles that will be considered historic and with character. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone for listening to my presentation. I do want to thank FIVA and FRMVE, as well as Lamia and all the organizers for organizing this conference. I do want to thank Gautam for inviting me to this conference. And I do, not listed here, but I do want to thank my roommate Evan for helping me run through this presentation, as well as my grandfathers for passing on this legacy, and my parents for raising me and bringing me to where I am today. And with that, I just wanted to leave you with one last picture of my dad and I riding our Cobra, basically. That's my great uncle's Cobra. This is something I really enjoy, riding cars with my dad, and I do hope that this historic sort of legacy of being able to ride historic cars is something that I carry on with my kids as well. So with that said, thank you very much.